Hi, my name is Johanna. I'm a PhD student who makes videos about things that I'm not an expert in. And today I would like to talk about aphantasia, which is something I have talked about previously on this channel. If you have absolutely no idea what aphantasia means, then I highly recommend that you go watch my other video that is more in depth on the topic and explains what it's about and how you know that you have it. However, I will briefly explain what aphantasia means just before we go and jump into it. Many people assume that we all see the same thing in our brain. Many people see images in their brain and they will assume that other people see images as well. However, some people do not see images, and the images that we see are very, very different. So aphantasia basically means the inability to see images in your head. Again, go watch my other video on the topic if you're interested. This video will be about the oldest aphantasia research. So the audience for this video is of course people who already know what aphantasia is, because if this is your first time hearing about it, you should not hear about it from this research. This research is old. There is way better and more current research on the topic. Let's dive right in. The research that we're looking at today is an article by Sir Francis Galton. The article is called Statistics of Mental Imagery. Mental imagery is the term Galton uses for anything that goes on in the brain, not just images, but all sensory experiences in the brain that are not the real world. So any imaginary things going on in the brain. The article is from 1880 and it was published in a journal called Mind. Now, something that is super important to know about Galton is that he was into eugenics. And eugenics are super problematic. So we are having a look at his research, but please keep in mind that his biases and his motivations for research are deeply problematic. So eugenics is the idea that some genes are better than others and that we should work to get to the good genes. Now, if you don't understand why that is inherently problematic, I think you should read up on it. So I think it's very important just to have that in the back of your mind. Galton is not someone you should look up to. And this will also become apparent in this article. So Galton starts off explaining how he began to wonder about this topic. He explains how he talks to fellow scientists and asks them about their experiences. I quote, "To my astonishment, I found that the great majority of the men of science to whom I first applied protested that mental imagery was unknown to them, and they looked on me as fanciful and fantastical in supposing that the words mental imagery really expressed what I believed everybody supposed them to mean. They had no more notion of its true nature than a colorblind man who was not discerned his defect has the nature of color. They had a mental deficiency of which they were unaware, and naturally enough supposed that those who were normally endowed were romancing." So this in and of itself is very interesting. He talks about people who say, no, there are no images at all. People are just making it up. People are just being romantic and poetic when they talk about mental imagery. And to my knowledge, he is the first person to talk about this weird gap where we all assume that whatever we experience, images or no images, is what everyone else experiences. And that is super interesting. And this is how his research starts. He asks around, he asks different types of people, he talks to people on the street, basically asking what do other people experience. Then he asks a lot of people. You may have figured this out from the title, Statistics. He's doing what we today would call a survey, and honestly quite a small scale survey. The way he did this was, first he asked 100 men. He says at least half of whom are distinguished in science or in other fields of intellectual work. So this seems to be his friends and companions, probably sort of upper class, middle class maybe people, but a certain demographic similar to himself, only men, only English, only white, it seems. And he asks them to describe their breakfast table. Based on this, he creates a scale. He ranks them from those who describe the breakfast table most vividly to those who describe it least vividly. Now, as mentioned, 100 men who are a very certain demographic is a very small scale study. He develops it a bit more. So based on the ranking of the vividness of mental imagery of the men, he creates a second survey that he sends out to boys. He sends this survey to 172 Charterhouse boys from a certain school. So again, we have a very narrow demographic. He then takes the results of the boys and the men and divide them into the different categories that he can find. He also compares the results to see if there's a difference between boys and men. So what Galton did was, he sent out letters and asked the people to imagine their breakfast table, something familiar to them. He asked them to reflect on how they see the table or do not see the table and send the results back to him. Based on these descriptions, he divided them into different categories, and in each category, he quotes specific passages and rank them from high to low. So let's have a look at these categories and how these people are ranked. So he has this big category called Vividness of mental imagery. And when we look at the quotes from the very clear mental imagery, we have brilliant, distinct, never blotchy, and quite compared to the real object. So here the most is to have something that is as vivid as real life, and that is constant, never wavering. The middle ground is, for example, fairly clear as a general image, details rather misty. And those who are at the bottom are extremely dim. Their impressions are in all respects so dim, vague, and transient that I doubt whether they can reasonably be called images. They are incomparably less than those of dreams. And one person goes, "My powers are 0. To my consciousness, there is almost no association of memory with objective visual impressions. I recollect the breakfast table, but I do not see it." The second category is color representation. So he's selecting quotes that are related to the color of the image. Again, we see the highest are close to reality. They call the colors natural, bright, distinct, clear. With the lowest, they all say power is nil, so they see no color. Interestingly enough, here we see not just in the lowest, but also in the quarter above the lowest, that adult males say power is nil. So it seems that a lot of people actually do not see color. And to the boys, we see color in the quarter above the lowest. The colors are dim, they see more like shades that have color in them. The next category is extent of field of mental view. So this means sort of like if you imagine a panorama, you can see more than the eye can see in a panorama, right? So this is basically, to my understanding, what he means with extent of field of view. Like, are we seeing, like, my eyes can see to here? Are we seeing more than that? Are we seeing less than that? Is the mental imagery sort of a narrow field of view? And here, the highest person actually has a field of view that is grander than that of the normal eye. So again, we are very much comparing the mental view to that of the natural eye. But here it becomes greater than what we can naturally see. And this is a personal note, I have also heard people describe that they can sometimes view objects from several angles at the same time. So this is sort of what we're talking about. Of course, we go narrower and narrower and into no field of view at all. Then Galton goes into the case of projecting an image. He discusses people who are able to look at something white and project an image onto that, and even people who can just sort of freely project images onto the real world. So that is sort of going beyond just seeing the real world or something similar to the real world in your mind, but being able to take what is in your mind and putting it into the real world. He also goes into discussing when people view images larger than reality. For example, the place and objects in a mental picture seems to be larger altogether than the reality. Thus, a room seems loftier and broader, and the objects in it taller. And then on the other hand, people who say that the images are smaller than reality, and whether or not they seem close or far away. So as you can hear, there is more to imagery than just do you see images or not. There's a lot of variation, and especially I think the idea of grandness, of scale and proximity is something I hadn't considered myself. It's insane to think about how much variation we have in our minds. Even just the video that I mentioned earlier, a lot of people have shared their personal experience in the comments, and it's mind-blowing how different they are. It's super interesting to think that we just assume everyone else has the exact same experience as us. It's quite naive, isn't it? What's very nice about Galton's research is he has these categories and he thinks about mental imagery from many different angles. It's also nice to have all these quotes. I think this is a very nice article for not actually using for research, but to use as a sort of inspiration of what could research include. However, as mentioned, he is super problematic. Let's look more into some of the problematic aspects. Of course, the way you did research back then was very different. A lot of the ways he does things would not be deemed viable today as anything than a pilot project. I won't go too much into that because I'm not an expert on statistics and using questionnaires. I use ethnography myself, so I can't comment too much on that, but it doesn't seem scientifically viable to me. However, I can comment on the biases that he is clearly portraying. Let's look into some of those, because it is honestly kind of fun. You learn a lot about the time and the way this guy thinks through the way he formulates stuff. Especially if you consider that he is not basing a lot of this on anything. Like, I will look at stuff where he's just sort of blatantly saying, this is probably how it is, but he's not substantiating it in anything. It's ridiculous. So he has this weird assumption that people of science do not see images at all, and people who are creative see a lot of images. Now, we do know that this is like statistically, people who are more creatively are more likely to see mental images. However, he says that and then he goes on to disprove it by showing the 100 men and how a lot of them view images somewhat or completely. Like, he says about half of these men are scientists, and only one of them seems to have complete aphantasia. So he's disproving himself. He also seems to allude that more women and children view images than men. For example, this quote, "Many men and a yet larger number of women and many boys and girls declared that they habitually saw mental imagery." But where's the proof? He just says this. It's unclear to me whether this is sort of statistically true or if it's just his assumptions. It seems very assumed. And I mean, again, when we look at his comparison between men and boys, the boys do not seem to be way more visual. Maybe a little bit, but they don't seem to be like significantly more visual. So what is he basing this on? His science isn't proving what he's saying. He's just saying it. And as mentioned, Galton is interested in eugenics. He specifically mentions that the object of his inquiry is to elicit facts that shall define the natural varieties of mental disposition in the two sexes and in the different races. But he only examines white men. Of course, I am assuming that this is sort of initial research on white men, and then later on he can compare that to women and people of other races. However, it is very clear on the way he talks about viewing images versus not viewing images that he sees not viewing images as better. It seems that aphantasia to him is superior. He is constantly saying how people of science do not view images. Men compared to women and children do not view images as much. His research doesn't really prove this, but whatever. There's just a lot of assumptions going on here, and you could only imagine how many shitty takes he would have if he added data on people who are not white. So it's just very, very important for me that you guys understand we are looking at some problematic research, and his reasons for doing research are just really, really shitty. Well, I hope you had fun. This video is not very informative. It's more than anything just a fun look at how research used to look, and well, sometimes not so fun. When you get into the biases, when you get into the sort of problematic backgrounds, it's less fun, but it's important to also mention those things. It would be very shitty of me to just say, let's have a look at Galton and then pretend that he was a completely cool scientist guy. It is important to look at the interesting things alongside the sad things in research. Well, have a wonderful day. I will see you in the next video. Bye.